Hi, my name is Ryan McEwen. I am professor in biology and Shoeline chair here in the Department of Biology, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the exit seminar portion of the Master's Thesis Defense for Peter Butterfield. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. So programming notes, first I will give a brief introduction, and Peter will give a presentation that may be around 40 minutes or so. Then there'll be time for the audience to ask questions, and we'll ask the general audience to depart the room, and the committee will stay after to ask questions not only about the oral defense you're going to see, but also the document that Peter has presented to the committee. So in the McEwen Lab, one of the primary goals of what we do is to provide opportunities for students. We want to be a career accelerator. One of the wonderful things about being a PI is that when this is carefully done, that there's an alignment of interest. So what's in the best interest of the student is also in the best interest of the lab and the department and the college and the university. And also because we work with land managers, in this case, the Forest Service, in some cases, we can actually benefit the ecosystem as well. This is difficult, of course, and embracing the goal of the scientific pursuit is one of the most important challenges of transitioning from an undergraduate to a graduate student. And in Peter's case, that was maximally abrupt because he's doing what we're calling a bachelor's plus master's program in the department. So his senior year was also of his undergraduate, actually the first year of his graduate program. So this is an extremely challenging transition. And for me personally, I don't think there could have been a better person for me to have. This is the first person I've worked with on a BPM than Peter. Peter is a consistently positive person to interact with in the lab, in the classroom. And in fact, it's gotten to the point now where in the classroom, I look for Peter's face because he seems to be enjoying himself all the time. So I honestly believe that I couldn't have had a better person to do this BPM with. He always seems to be looking to elevate the conversation and add some humor. And I know Peter is a sports fan. And I just want to say it's been a pleasure to have you in the locker room. So Peter's projects have been quite challenging. So humans have a hard time thinking about forest development, which transpires over centuries. So if you're a Drosophila researcher, imagine if your experiment was going to end in 21, 23. Process what you have to think about. So it was challenging for Peter to think about or to establish a proper framework for the project. The project is part of a broader program. And so it was really challenging for Peter to think about how does his work fit in with that broader program. And the tree ring technique also is fiddly and challenging and difficult. The data analysis is difficult. The data collection is difficult. And sort of putting those together to come up to scientific conclusions is also quite challenging. And Peter has risen to the challenge over and over again. And it's been a real pleasure. In fact, Peter's been incredibly attuned to comments. This is one thing I want to say as a characteristic of Peter's development is incredibly attuned to comments from even in our brown bag or our committee members. And then what would happen is after there would be a committee meeting or something, and the very next time Peter would present, he would say something like, for example, Dr. Hellman said X, and I have done Y. And I just have to say that's one of the strongest in terms of a graduate student development.
Alexa, stop.
Kelly Butterfield. Okay, there we go. What was I saying? Oh, just it's a pleasure to work with someone who is willing to raise their level in response to critique. This is one of the most important things for a graduate student to do, and Peter's done that beautifully. As a lab PI, it's literally my job to keep us balanced through cycles of students in and out, and permanence is a key feature of what we do in the lab. And I just want to clearly say it's going to be really sad for Peter to leave the lab, for all of us to have him not here anymore. Even so, Peter secured a position at Yellowstone National Park, which is the most ecologist thing to do possible. So this is very nice to have happening. It's really exciting. I'm really excited to see where his career goes. But before that, we have one more opportunity to hear from Peter. So help me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much, Dr. McEwen, for the introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking about my thesis project,
entitled A Century of Disturbance and Dynamics During the Establishment of White Oak Dominance in Forests of Southeastern Ohio, Implications for Sustainable Forest Management. So to begin with a broad ecological concept, forest community assembly is a process that occurs over decades and is largely controlled by two factors, them being disturbance and competition. So disturbance processes cause mortality of individuals in the forest and remove biomass from the system as a whole. Important disturbance processes include wind, fire, and herbivory. An example of a disturbance process could be a tornado, which when it rips through a forest, it could look like this. And you can see the large removal of biomass from the system at large. And in nearly all forests, light is by far the most important limiting resource. So competition for this resource is a fundamental biotic filter that dictates community assembly over the long term of this forest span. So for example, these large trees don't allow much light into the forest when they're this tall and up in the canopy. There's a lot of shade in the understory. And so that tornado that I mentioned earlier as a disturbance could leave the forest looking something like this. And you can see the amount of light availability is very large in this section of the forest itself. So understanding how both disturbance and competition drive forest community assembly is a fundamental task in ecology, which also presents highly practical modern applications in restoration, conservation, and management. The oak genus, or the Quercus genus, is a globally important genus of tree that has a deep history of importance in both forests and in human cultures. Oak forests rely heavily on understanding community assembly in these systems, and it's important to know these systems to then further understand oak forests themselves. So again, understanding how both disturbance and competition regulate oak forests in general or in specific is a broad and pressing scientific objective. Oaks are also what is known as a model clade, a clade being a group of organisms that have evolved from a common ancestor. This helps link evolution with ecology in this case. And this is due to the fact that oaks are found on 5 different continents. They inhabit a wide variety of diverse habitats and also support a large amount of biological diversity. So from this same paper, you can see these top 2 blue bar graphs. There's a number of species in the genus on the y-axis, and in the blue bars, again, on the x-axis, there are the different genera. This is in the United States and Mexico, and the Quercus genus in both the United States and Mexico has the greatest amount of species in the genus, kind of by far, in both these places. And a similar pattern can be seen in these green bar graphs, which on the y-axis, this is the proportion of tree biomass in naturally assembled forests. And in the United States and Mexico, again, Quercus is the clear winner, if you will. So in North America specifically, there's very strong evidence for Native American use of oak trees, including evidence of both their cultivation and management. Management specifically of the white oak group to enhance its success has been done in Native American cultures for a long time. And an example of this is flour being made as a dietary staple from white oak acorns in many different Native American cultures. Numerous tribes also use the bur oak acorn as food, as well as for medicinal purposes. More of this information can be found in the Native American ethnobotany, and please contact me if you need more resources for this type of research. Oaks also have a vast European cultural and historical significance. I'd consider them what is known as a flagship species, or kind of like a cultural icon. They're a symbol of strength, nobility, and heritage. They're often mentioned in mythology, folklore, and the Bible. They're sacred tree to Zeus, Thor, and Celtic druids. And they're used in modern Western and European literature extensively as well. So for example, this is the coat of arms of Hungary in the top left. This left part of the wreath is an oak wreath. You can see the different oak leaves and even the acorns up in here in this coat of arms. But right below that is the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. This wreath is actually made of oak leaves, representing the strength of the country at the time World War II ended. In the middle here is a Celtic druid or a wizard-like figure up in an oak tree performing a ritual. And then if you're a nerd, on the right, Thorin Oakenshield is the name of this character on the right, and he's from the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings series. Oaks also have great ecological significance, if that was not already apparent. They help to maintain a biodiverse landscape. Their nutrient-dense acorns provide nutrition for wildlife, and they're a home for numerous species of animals, insects, fungi, and bacteria, including over 500 species of moss and butterflies alone. There's strong evidence that oaks were important in eastern North America for thousands of years, from pollen evidence, and they've also been recorded in colonial documents such as land surveillance and forestry records, and they were known to have helped in constructing cabins and shelters throughout the 1800s. Oaks have current economic significance. So over 120,000 jobs alone in Ohio are from the fields of ecology, agriculture, and forestry. Oaks are a large part of these fields. Similarly, in 2020, Ohio forestry contributed $27 billion to the economy. Oaks are, again, a large part of this forestry effort. And other industries rely on oaks as well, such as the alcohol industry with bourbon barrels and the carpentry industry with furniture and flooring. So in the modern landscape, oaks are a dominant large tree across much of eastern North America. Here you can see both the range and the importance of white oak on top and northern red oak below it. Their range really for both of these species is from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and then from the Great Plains to the Atlantic Ocean. Darker blue here indicates dominance as a large tree. So you can see the importance value gradient goes from this lighter blue to the darker blue here. And so you can see how wide ranging these species are, as well as their importance in eastern North America. Furthering this point, this is an example of a static forest composition that is pretty representative of the eastern deciduous forest in general. You can see that there are 5 different species of oaks listed here, and these top 4 are really dominant in these basal area and density characteristics in the overstory. But recently, over the past 100 to 150 years, there's been what's been seen as an oak to maple dominant shift. So maples have become much more frequent and abundant than oaks in their regeneration layers. This is suggestive of a long-term dynamic, and specifically Acer rubrum or red maple and Acer saccharum, which is sugar maple, have become much more abundant than oaks in these regeneration layers. So looking at this same example of static forest composition in the mid-story and looking at Acer rubrum and Acer saccharum, in the mid-story, there's not really another species that comes close in basal area or density. The only other species that comes relatively close is Fagus grandifolia, or the American beech tree. And it's important to note also that in the overstory, these maples are certainly not slacking in these characteristics either. So oaks are a dominant large tree and forest in the modern landscape, but regeneration is very poor across much of eastern North America. So again, looking at the left side, you've already seen is the range and the importance values. On the right is what's known as the regeneration index of oaks. This is a gradient that goes from red to green here, and red and orange indicates the absence of a small tree for these oak species. So you can see that there really is just oranges, reds, and yellows. There's no green in the regeneration index for both of these species. Contrary to a static example, this is a more dynamic example over a 20-year change in the forest. Again, pretty representative of the eastern deciduous forest. QUMO, QUVE, and QUAL are chestnut oak, black oak, and white oak respectively. And then QUCO is the scarlet oak. ACRU is Acer rubrum, or the red maple. And so in the overstory, you can see that the relative density and relative basal area of the maple trees is increasing. These asterisks on top of the bars show that these are increasing significantly. And you can see that these oaks are either stagnating or decreasing significantly in both these statistics. In the mid-story, a similar thing is taking place. It's a bit more apparent in the oak community right here. All these oak species, again, most of these on the left side, and then the Quercus coccinea, which is the scarlet oak on the right, is either stagnating or decreasing significantly, like these 3 species over here, while the maple species is increasing in relative basal area significantly. So the oak community, again, from this mid-story example, is drastically decreasing over this 20-year time period, where maples are increasing significantly. This is again taking place on a regional scale. So oaks have a mostly red regeneration index, as I mentioned earlier, but the maple regeneration index down here, again, you can see the red maple and sugar maple are important and wide-ranging species on the eastern deciduous forest, but it's almost the inverse of the oak regeneration index here. There's plenty of green to be seen in both red maple and sugar maple, suggesting a much greater regeneration. So does this matter? You may be asking yourself, wouldn't oak trees being outcompeted be a natural occurrence or some sort of successional event that happens over time? I would argue that no to both of these questions. Oaks have been dominant in the eastern deciduous forest for thousands of years, and this type of succession has never been observed in recorded history before. So potential consequences of this are a shift in biodiversity. So what may survive and thrive currently in oak forests may not survive and thrive in a more maple-dominated system. Food sources for animals change. These acorns that I mentioned that are very nutrient dense would be replaced by those helicopter-looking things that maples produce called samaras, which are they're less nutrient dense for wildlife. There could be changes in soil characteristics and in the due to different bark characteristics, different leaf characteristics as well. And it also could be an economic and human goods and services threat. As I mentioned, all those jobs that oaks help to create in ecology and agriculture, as well as the industries such as the alcohol industry and the carpentry industry that rely on them, could see that heavily use oaks could see a drastic decline in both jobs and availability. So knowing of this issue, there's been a lot of scientific research going into oak forest management. A lot of this effort has gone into just seeing how to make oaks regenerate better and make them more successful in their regeneration layers. So a series of colloquia, such as this Fire in Eastern Oak Forest Delivering Science to Land Managers Conference in 2005, has sparked research consortia, no pun intended. Oak Woodlands and Forests, the Fire Consortium came from this. So oak regeneration has really been a central issue of Eastern forest ecology throughout the past around 25 years. The scientific research has led to three main paradigms of Eastern oak, the Eastern oak species. So one, the establishment of oak seedlings in forests is naturally plentiful and easy to accomplish, but enabling the seedlings to transition to saplings and climb into the canopy is a very hard task to accomplish. This is otherwise known as the oak seedling bottleneck. Two, oaks are not successful in long-term competition with maples in low light environments. So maples are much more shade tolerant than oak species. They can survive in low light conditions for much longer periods of time than oak species. And three, fire was a historically important disturbance process in Eastern oak forests that filtered out competition by causing mortality of maple seedlings. This is what is known as the oak fire hypothesis. So getting a little more into the oak fire hypothesis, this posits that a lack of fires today that occurred in the past, known as historic fires, is causing this lack of oak regeneration. This has to do with characteristics of both oaks and maples. So as you can see here, this oak seedling has a very dense and robust root system. And so it should be able to tolerate fire because it dedicates a lot of its growth and its growing strategy to this root system. While maple seedlings on the right here allocate more energy to top growth and have a more fibrous root system and what is known as a shoots over roots type growth strategy. So fire is able to destroy more total seedling biomass than that of the maples than that of the oaks. So if an absence of fire is the problem, then reintroducing this may be the solution to this. There have been plenty of experiments that analyze prescribing fire versus unburned sites to test this question and this hypothesis. So this is an experiment from 2006, which analyzed the stand structure over 9 years in a burned and fire excluded oak stands in Kentucky. Hopefully you can read these, it's kind of blurry, but the density is on the y-axis, that's in stems per hectare. And then on the x-axis, there are 3 different sites, a fire excluded site, a 2 times burn site, and a 3 times burn site. The leftmost bar in each of these sites is red maple species. And then the rightmost bar on each of these sites is the oak species, total oak species at the site. The bars, the white bar with the dots is the seedling layer, while the darker bar on top here in this case is the sapling layer. So in the fire excluded sites, you can see that red maple has a much larger density than all other oak species. In the 2 times burn site, it seems that way again, but these results are technically statistically insignificant due to this large error bar in the red maple species. And in the 3 times burn site, interestingly again, the sapling layer for the maples seems to be rising. And again, the density in total is much larger for the red maple than the oak species. So I think this study kind of sums up a lot of the research that's gone into prescribing fire. And a sentence I liked that did sum it up was long-term results of burning alone may or may not support the goal of promoting oak regeneration through prescribed fire. So reintroducing fire alone has produced inconsistent and mixed results among land managers. More work is needed to refine our understanding of the formation of the oak forest. So just to reiterate, oaks are currently dominant in the canopy of forests in Eastern North America. If they are so readily outcompeted by maples today, how did this oak forest come to form in the first place? So the overarching question of our study, and a lot of studies similar to it, are what was the role of disturbance and competition during the formation of the current oak overstory? Oak forest formation occurs through a process called stand development. Generally, stands are developed following a disturbance. So as I mentioned earlier, you can think of a tornado in this case is what's known as a stand initiating disturbance. The stand initiates, and a general model of forest development called secondary succession occurs, where stems are often resprouting or emerging from their seedling status, and dispersal and establishment is relatively minimal. So the disturbance happens, the stand initiates, some stems are excluded while others are able to rise. The understory reinitiates underneath the overstory, and this culminates in what is known as an old growth forest. So this has the canopy, the midstory, the understory, some dead trees, dead tree dynamics, some microbial dynamics underneath the understory. And this can take upwards of 300 years for this to happen. So this is too long a time scale for normal ecological experiments to be studied by humans who the average age, I bet, is around 80. So you would do this, how could you do this? You would do this by using tree rings and what's known as dendrochronological analysis. So dendrochronological analysis is the studying and dating of annual rings produced in trees. It's used for a host of different analyses, such as climate information, fire events, insect activity, and archaeological reasons. Dating is extremely reliable when done correctly and accurate down to the exact season of growth. Evidence of disturbance is permanent in the wood anatomy, for example, a fire scar. And specific time, tree rings can also reach a specific time period that cannot be reached by other methods as efficiently. So in that hundreds of years type of time frame, tree rings can reach very accurately, as I mentioned. Just a little tree ring anatomy. There are only a few things I need you to know from this slide. This is a red oak sample, for example, but the pith is the center of the stem up here. And then a growth ring is composed of the early wood, which is this lighter band here, and the late wood, which is this darker band here. So the early wood combined with the late wood is known as a growth ring. Looking at a real white oak sample and looking at a microscopic image of this, again, you can see the lighter band on the right and this darker band here. This constitutes 1 year of growth from one winter to the next. So using dendrochronological analysis, you can reconstruct patterns of disturbance through the analysis of fire scars, as I mentioned. Fires injure the cambium of trees, which is then encapsulated in what's known as wound wood. And the wounds are located within tree ring series and can be dated again down to the exact year. So this helps to reconstruct the role of fire as a disturbance process historically, and also provides land managers with what are known as reference conditions. So how frequent did these fires happen in history? How severe were they? And how big were the scars? And when exactly did these fires happen? You can also reconstruct patterns of competition through analysis of suppression and release. This has to do with what are called canopy gaps, and a release is a period of sustained growth, while suppression is a period of stunted growth. So light is a limiting resource for forest understory plants. Trees growing in low light conditions will exhibit limited growth and have very narrow tree rings. So you can see here on the y-axis is tree ring width in millimeters. And usually the x-axis for these types of plots is some sort of time, usually in years. One dot in this instance indicates 1 year of growth. So you can see that this tree is growing in very low light conditions because its tree ring widths rarely exceed this 0.5 millimeter threshold for numerous years in a row. Here's another visual example to maybe help you visualize this. This quarter covers over 50 years of tree rings. So kind of maybe giving you a better size example for how narrow these tree rings really are. But when a canopy gap is created by an overtopping tree's death, more light is able to penetrate the canopy, and the trees exposed to this light grow much, much faster. So using the same example of the quarter, on the left here, you can see it covers over 50 years of rings. But on the right, after an extreme release event and an influx of light, the same quarter only covers 6 years. And you can really even see this with your naked eye, just how different these rings look that the quarter is covering. So substantial and rapid increases in growth can only be driven by an extreme change in the light environment. Changes in climate and soil conditions or different water conditions can certainly be detected by trees and by their rings, but they can be screened out statistically just to look for the light environment conditions. Release analysis specifically focuses on transition thresholds that have been established empirically, again, to represent the substantial change in light environment only. This is associated with mortality events that open gaps in the forest canopy, hence the term canopy gaps. So again, kind of to visualize this in a few different ways, this is a period of suppressed growth in the blue brackets, which corresponds with this sample on the right. So you can see again how low in millimeters this tree is growing over numerous years. So release analysis focuses on situations when trees are suppressed by competition due to these low light conditions. In addition to this, release analysis also focuses on when these trees are released due to changes in these light conditions. So similarly to the blue bracket, you can see in the green bracket, again, pretty much with your naked eye, how different these tree rings look over here than they do in here. And this corresponds to this sample on the right with this period of released growth. A specific release event is identified by a preset mathematical threshold. So it's somewhere between this period of suppression and this period of sustained growth. There's been a ton of empirical work on this topic in tree ring science. A lot of this has been devoted to how different species grow, the different events, as I mentioned, like climatic events or different soil characteristics that would cause trees to grow at different amounts each year. But again, the main one we're focusing on here is screening everything out for these light conditions. So analysis can also provide information about stand conditions that require an oak sapling to transition into a large tree in the forest canopy. This has direct management implications. Foresters can and currently do implement various harvesting techniques. Two techniques now are technically one technique is known as thinning or patch harvesting, where certain large trees are cut down to allow light to reach the understory. So as part of a long-term collaboration with Dr. Todd Hutchison of the U.S. Forest Service, our objective is to use tree ring analysis of canopy-dominant white oaks to assess disturbance and competition during the formation of the oak forest canopy in southeastern Ohio. Our research site is Vinton Furnace State Forest in southeastern Ohio. This is near like geographic midpoint of the range of white oaks. And these forests mostly established from 1880 through 1930. Management for sustaining white oaks is a primary objective of the U.S. Forest Service itself, state agencies, and also land management organizations, including Ohio's The Nature Conservancy and Holden Forests and Gardens. So to be more specific, Vinton Furnace State Forest is within Vinton County in the red here in Ohio. And then these two sites, Arch Rock and Watch Rock, were both around 90 hectares in size and very close to one another geographically. This in yellow is just a wildlife preserve, and the green is the state forest itself. So to get the fire history reconstruction, again, dendrochronological methods were used to analyze fire scars. There was a total of 77 samples, 4 being chestnut oak and the rest being white oak. There were 39 samples at the Watch Rock site and then 38 at the Arch Rock site. So samples were marked to get cut down. They were cut down with a chainsaw in total. And then another sample called a cross-section sample was taken just above the forest floor on the tree's stump. These cross-section samples were labeled and then they were sanded down. They were measured. The tree rings were counted. The fire scars were found and then counted and also dated with the label here. And So the tree rings were dated, the scars were dated, and a fire history for the site was created. Much progress has been made on developing the fire history for the site. This culminated in the 2 research papers being published from this fire scar history of the site. And it's important to thank these 2 people for the crucial role they helped in developing the fire history data. Dr. Brian McCarthy from Ohio University and Dr. Bob Ford from the United States Forest Service. So again, going back to this overarching question, the role of disturbance and competition during the formation of the oak overstory, disturbance being the fire history and competition being the gap and light dynamics. Disturbance history we had in hand, but the competition and the actual growth release information we still had yet to get. And that's where my research really comes in. So the fire scar information was in hand. Next, the role of competition needed to be discovered. So this requires not just counting and dating of the rings, but also measuring their ring widths. So samples were retrieved from the U.S. Forest Service in Delaware, Ohio, and 65 of the original samples were able to be collected, 33 from the Arch Rock site and 32 from Watch Rock. So the samples were taken up to room 222 to be measured in like an extension of the McEwen lab. And they were read using a microscope. And this silver thing here is known as a unislide. So you could put the sample right on this sliding stage that moves from left to right. And each new ring you saw underneath the microscope, you would click a button. This would correspond with softwares known as Talervo and Windendro. And then it would show up with the ring width measurement up on the screen in millimeters. The disturbance reconstruction analysis I use, this is more of the statistical methods. I use what is known as a radial growth averaging technique from Nowacki and Abrams' 1997 paper, but I modified it a little bit to be more conservative in detecting these release events. So their study used old growth overstory oaks as well. And I used over 35%, in between 35 and 50% indicated a moderate release, while over 50% was indicative of a major release. And again, just to kind of give a statistical breakdown, the formula of growth change was M2 minus M1 over M1 times 100, where M1 equals the average growth of the preceding 10-year period, including the target year that you'd like to know, and M2 was the average growth of the following 10-year period. I also luckily did not have to do a lot of statistics by hand or by Excel. I used the R programming language and what is known as the Trader package. So this produces CSV and JPEG files of samples according to the disturbance detection methods that you set within the package. And this includes different release criteria such as all release years, first year of release, the amount of moderate releases, the amount of major releases, etc. I also went into the study with 2 main predictions. Oaks should experience rapid growth in their first decade due to open conditions to be able to further compete for spots in the canopy. And anthropogenic fire suppression limited fire in the site after around 1930. So a stark contrast should be apparent between growth releases and fires post 1930. So with these 2 predictions in mind and in hand, and the tree rings, they were counted, dated, so fire scar history was in hand, and then the growth release history was now in hand. Let's get into some results of the study. So beginning with a pretty basic figure, the establishment date is on the x-axis here, and the y-axis is just the sample diameter in centimeters. The darker gray circles are from the Arch Rock site, and the lighter gray circles are from the Watch Rock site. Each circle indicates 1 tree sample. So trees in the study established from around 1830 to, at the latest, around 1950, and sizes of the basal diameter ranged from 10 to 74 centimeters. There was no real statistical or apparent difference between sizes and sites. They were pretty consistent throughout both sites. Also, just to orient you before I get into some later figures, again, 1 year is just 1 dot on a figure like this. The years are on the x-axis and the ring widths are in millimeters on the y-axis. So looking at a sample from the Watch Rock site, this is just the ring width and growth history. Now you can see with fire scars indicated by these red arrows here, this sample experienced fire scars right around 1880 and then another right around 1900. And now this is with growth release events. So you can see again, the fires are already here in the red arrows, but the release events are in blue arrows. So this was in 1860, there was a release event, and then right around 1900 as well, there was another release event taking place. So these four figures, this may be a lot at first, but I think they're pretty representative of both study sites and the study in general. You can already see the variation in release events and fire scarring for these samples. Each of these samples established before 1860. And so ARF 7 in the top left and ARF 8 are two of the most geographically close samples. And even they experience some variation in their different growth releases. ARF 7 experiencing a release around 1920, and then ARF 8 experiencing two, one before 1900 and one right around 1920 as well. And also below this, you can see, again, just the variation in the fire histories from, again, two samples from the same site. So WRC3 experienced two fires one around 1880 and then another around 1900, while WRF8 experienced three fires, one around 1880 and then two right around 1920. One of the fires is kind of hiding behind one of the growth releases as well. But I think this was, again, a very representative group of figures that show the variation between sites and even within the same site. Again, to kind of orient you, this is what's known as a release chronology. So each horizontal line here just represents a tree or a sample, however you would like to think about that. And these blue triangles indicate just growth release. The x-axis is time in years. And so this sample on the bottom, established before 1850, I believe this was in the 1830s, and it experienced two releases throughout its entire lifetime up to cutting in the early 2000s. Similarly, this is what's known as a fire chronology. So each line, again, is one sample or one tree. The only difference here is that these red diamonds indicate fire scars. So this sample, for example, established again right around 1850, and it experienced four different fires, three in pretty rapid succession here, and then one near the end of its life. It's also important to note that around 1940, I consider this to be the historic fire period, while these fires closer to 2000 and in the 1990s were prescribed fires from the site. So just to kind of overlay these two figures on top of one another for the Arch Rock site, you can see that there are releases happening throughout the entire chronology on numerous different samples. Again, some of the older samples don't release and then don't release for a while. Some of the younger samples release quite a bit. And there's really an abrupt end to fire right around in the 1940s until the prescribed fire era over here. A similar pattern can be seen in the Watch Rock releases and the fire history. There's releases they're sparse and they're consistent at the same time throughout the entire release chronology, while fires seemingly end right here until the prescribed fire period happens again. So oaks should experience rapid growth in their first decade due to open conditions. Going back to this prediction and this question I had in the beginning, this does not really seem to be supported other than this Watch Rock release chronology here. A lot of these samples did release within their first decade, but it only seems to happen in the 1860s with these 6 samples here. And the lowest sample does not count because that was much later than 10 years for it. But again, throughout this chronology, you cannot see that decade being the prime time for these releases to happen. And this is really not supported at all in the Arch Rock site. So it's important to note also that the Arch Rock site in general was a lot younger than the Watch Rock site. There were only 2 samples around for this in the 1860s at the Arch Rock site, but this decade really is not supported by this. So the answer to this study really does not support this prediction. The second prediction, however, that fire suppression limited fire in the site after 1930. So a stark contrast should be seen between fire and gap releases or gap dynamics. So fires would abruptly end and gap dynamics and releases would persist. Again, this is kind of this is nearing the end of the historic fire period. And you can see here, I put this in brackets. Hopefully it's a bit more apparent. that when fires seem to end historically, releases definitely still keep happening, regardless of these fires. So there's zero fires really happening from the 1940s through the 1990s, and all of these releases are still happening in both the Watch Rock sites and the Arch Rock site as well. So here you can just see the similarities between these sites taking place in both their fire history and their release information. So I would argue that this study definitely supports the fire abruptly ending and the releases persisting prediction. So to summarize them both, the first prediction was really not supported by this research, but the second one certainly was. And so more of what the results mean, about 10 to 15 years after a major fire event, few samples released. This suggests an overall weak link between fire and growth releases. Only 2 samples released within 3 years of a fire scar that experienced one, which was only 7%. In the 1860s, there were a smaller density of white oaks at the time, but the frequency of major releases was the highest. So that over 50% threshold that I said was met consistently and if you remember from the 1860s, these were the main samples that released at that time. While again, this really was not seen in the 1860s due to the Arch Rock site having younger samples than the Watch Rock site. In the 1940s through the 1970s, there are also some interesting patterns. That's really when there are 0 fires happening, but those releases continue to happen. And also something interesting from these results is that both sites and different samples experienced different releases at different times. Again, given the geographic similarity of both of these sites and a lot of the samples, this is a pretty interesting result. Another way to think about this was I did another statistical analysis. This one looked at the establishment of the different samples. And so this looked at years 1 through 20, their average growth, and 21 through 40. If years 1 through 20 had a larger average growth than years 21 through 40, this indicated a gap origin sample. While if years 21 through 40 had a larger average than years 1 through 20, this indicated an understory origin sample. So you can see the differences among sites for both their gap origin and understory origin samples. In the Arch Rock, 9 gap origin samples released, while 4 did not release at all throughout their lifetime. And then on Watch Rock, there were 15 gap origin samples that released, with 3 that did not release. In Arch Rock, there was 20 understory origin samples that did release, and 0 samples showed no release. And then at the Watch Rock site, there were 10 that were understory origin that did release, and 4 that did not release. And again, this is just looking at the 1940s through the 1970s. There was over 15 releases taking place throughout, again, numerous samples in the Watch Rock site without the existence of fires or fire scars. And Arch Rock release, there was over 20 during the same period for this without the existence of fires. So it's apparent that historic fires are not coinciding with release events, at least evidenced by this study. So what could be driving these growth releases? The study sites were harvested for help in the Civil War effort in the 1850s through charcoal iron furnaces. So presumably oaks harvested were already large, opening large gaps for light to penetrate the understory and allowed these younger trees to release. Again, that pattern in the 1860s, a lot of those young oaks released right after this period of deforestation. In the early 1920s, the Agricultural Appropriations Act passed. So the U.S. Forest Service heeded the call of nature. The bill made special reference to the prevention of forest fires, which would then go on to subsequent policy would then go on to further the actions needed to prevent forest fires. And there was something called chestnut blight that happened. So American chestnut trees were large dominant canopy trees in the eastern United States until the early 20th century. A pathogenic fungus devastated the species. And in a period of about 40 years from 1904 to 1940, virtually all chestnuts were wiped out. And this was introduced in New York, so it spread westward from New York. So these 3 major historical events, in my opinion, the Civil War effort increasing massive clearing efforts, the Agricultural Appropriations Act of 1922 and subsequent U.S. Forest Service policy, and then a large percentage of American chestnut deaths has all kind of led to the fires ceasing and the releases continuing. So to wrap up what this study means, in this case, this reaffirms that light is the most limiting resource for trees. Fire does not seem to influence growth releases, but canopy gaps certainly do, again, supported by this study. Oaks released without the presence of recent fires happening, and the arrival of chestnut blight and major historical events such as the U.S. Forest Service fire prevention policy, as well as the Civil War, seem to coincide with these growth releases. From a management standpoint, the falling of old canopy trees can and does lead to increased young oak regeneration. Research and my own anecdotal experience suggests that fire can certainly aid in this process, but weighing the benefits of oaks, of large trees and large oaks that can live for around or over 400 years is certainly an essential thing to do, as these large trees provide a host of ecosystem services themselves. And so to further this point, selective thinning and different patch cutting methods should be implemented. Making gap spaces intentionally above these oak saplings and seedlings is important so they directly get this influx of light. And monitoring growth of both these oak saplings and seedlings and making sure that competition among other species such as maples is minimal is very important as well from a management standpoint. And with that, I'd like to thank, there's plenty of people and a lot of organizations to thank. Dr. Ryan McEwen, thank you so much for the mentorship and the support throughout this entire process. It's really been a great time. Dr. Chelsea Prather and Dr. Jen Hellman of my graduate advisory committee, they have helped so much with this presentation and my writing in general. Dr. Todd Hutchison and Dr. Bob Ford from the United States Forest Service, various members of the McEwen Lab, the University of Dayton Biology Department, Dr. Kristen DeGraw, Holden Forest and Gardens or Holden Arboretum, and last but not least, my family and friends. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Really good talking.
Thank you.
Does fire tend not to cause canopy gaps? And then I want to ask, east versus west. Seems like there's these huge fires in the west all the time that taking out counties and stuff. Might you get a different result? Maybe you don't do oaks in the west. I don't know that, but in the west versus the east, due to index of fire on canopy.
Yeah, I know that a lot of, at least historically with climate change, there's a lot of, I'm sure the fire intensity is much larger, but fire, ponderosa pine example, is an example ecosystem that needs fire to reproduce. So their fires are a lot larger already out west. As in oak species, I'm not really sure. There wasn't too much. I was so focused in the eastern deciduous forest. I didn't really look at too much literature in such a different environment like the west. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, I think. Hopefully that answers it as well.
That was a great talk.
Thank you.
I kind of have two questions. One, do you think the American chestnut blight might have actually artificially induced higher fire rates because of all the dead stands of trees? It looked like between 1900 and 1940 there were a lot of fires. I wonder if that actually might be associated with that. And then the second question is, do you think we're going to be seeing more dynamic changes with ash trees being wiped out?
Yeah, that's the ash tree question. I'll answer that. We just talked about that in lab the other day, actually. Ash trees, there are still from what I understand, the chestnut was just one specific species that got taken out, but ash trees have multiple different species, with blue ash being the most resistant to emerald ash borer. So it could be there's definitely certainly effects of this loss of ash tree, but I think it will be somewhat less than the catastrophic loss of chestnuts. And with fire occurrence, that's a really interesting point. And I think that, yeah, it definitely could have, anthropogenic stress seems to, like use of the railroads seem to increase a lot of fires at that time. I'm sure that those chestnuts could have been fuel since there were so many dead ones laying around throughout the early 1900s, but I haven't looked into that. So hopefully that answers those. Oh. That's gonna get grilled. Thank you. No.
The sapling, oak sapling has a more robust root. Would that role in fire, being able to withstand fire, would your study have captured that impact? Meaning, were you able to measure release in saplings, I guess?
I was not. These were just the full, these were live, all those cross-section samples that you saw that were just the dead, yeah, they were very large. I was not able to measure the sapling releases.
If fire maybe wasn't important to the adult, but it was important, it's still possible to report to sapling in the sense of promoting oak over maple.
Yeah, and recently I went to Zaleski State Forest, and it definitely is important. There was a lot of oak regenerate, but then it causes that bottleneck that I mentioned of the oaks not being able to reach the canopy. So fire helped them to get into that sapling and seedling type layer, like pretty tall, but not it. I don't know. Once they get that high, getting them into the canopy is still a struggle. It seems.
Two events are needed.
Yeah, it's yeah. It seems like there's multiple things that need to happen.
Curiosity. So you can, when a fire occurs, you can tell which year that happened, right? Based on the scar.
Yes.
But can you tell if there's multiple fires in a year, or is it just like it's one scar per year, or what if there was like multiple fires?
I'm not entirely positive. I know if fires were to happen on different sides of the tree and scar a different side of the tree, they could potentially happen in the same year. I know that you can also tell that when the wound is like encapsulated and when it technically closes, the date of that. But in the same year, I'm not entirely sure if it happened like on the directly same spot. I'm not sure how you would detect that, or if it would just be one large scar. Yeah.
That's one more methods question. So I'm not familiar with tree growth rings at all, but I've thought a bit about bone growth rings.
Okay.
One issue with that is that as you get older and older, some of the rings in the center begin to kind of combine to like central core. Does that happen in trees? Like, is the pith like condensed rings? You actually start seeing like, and do the earliest rings persist for the entire life of the tree?
It seems in oaks are pretty relatively easy rings to read. I know there's a lot of research on false rings and probably some of the similar dynamics that you said in bones. I'm not entirely sure the answer to that question. I know that Luke Weinstein, who recently graduated, and he was doing some stuff. He asked if you could use Talervo for fish bone measurements. So that was he said they look exactly the same. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure of the dynamics of that as they get older, but I would think that it'd be somewhat different. That's about the best I can. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh. Oh. Thank you. I'll call those people later.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, Peter, one more time. The general audience to depart, and we will gather just outside the door on the right. The defense will commence here in a couple of minutes, and I can't say for sure how long that'll go, but I would think we'll gather for refreshments at say around 2 or 4 to. So thank you. Thank you very much.